At 4:11 on a Tuesday afternoon, the CEO's assistant called down to my desk and asked me to come up to the 12th floor, no explanation given. I was $698,000 from the final balloon payment on the house I'd bought after my divorce, and I remember thinking, on the elevator up, that whatever this was, it had better not cost me that. I checked the badge holder clipped to my belt out of old habit, the same scuffed leather case I'd carried through every client site visit for 19 years, the leather worn pale from tarmac dust at a half-dozen drone hub build-outs. My name is Miles Rutherford. I'm 56, and for 19 years I was the senior program director Orion Skyfreight, put in front of its biggest clients, the one whose name got written into contracts as a condition of doing business. 22 days earlier, Mateo Figueroa had pulled me off the Meridian account to make room for his son. The corporate language for it was leadership transition, effective immediately. The plain language reality was that Mateo wanted Adrian running a $52 million drone delivery rollout, and my name was inconveniently still the one the client's own contract required in that seat. I hadn't called Meridian. I hadn't leaked a complaint to procurement, hadn't emailed a competitor, hadn't done anything except answer an ordinary phone call from a woman named Elena Castillo 19 days earlier. Honestly, the way I'd answered every call from her for 2 years. She'd asked, in passing, whether I'd be at the site walkthrough the following month. I told her I was off the account. That was the entire extent of what I'd done. One true sentence, spoken to someone who already had every right to ask the question in the first place. I want to be precise about that, because by the time I reached the 12th floor, at least one version of this story already had me orchestrating something. I hadn't orchestrated anything. 19 years in this industry teaches you that the fastest way to lose a client relationship permanently is to make yourself the center of a complaint. I'd said nothing to Elena that wasn't already true, and true things, said plainly, have a way of traveling on their own schedule once someone with a reason to check the paperwork starts checking it. The rest of what happened without me. Meridian ran its own vendor compliance review on its own quarterly schedule, the way large clients do, and found that the key personnel clause in their $52 million contract, the clause naming me, specifically, as a condition of the engagement, had been quietly violated with no formal notice, no amendment, no signature from anyone at Meridian agreeing to the swap. By the time the elevator doors opened on 12, I already understood something Mateo apparently hadn't. A clause like that doesn't care who Mateo wants running the account. It only cares whether the paper matches the people, and for 22 days, it hadn't. I stepped off the elevator, badge holder still clipped to my belt, into the particular hush of a floor that already knows something expensive has gone wrong, and walked toward a glass conference room where I could see the CEO standing, phone pressed to her ear, listening to someone say something visibly not what she wanted to hear. Nobody in that room, I'd learned within the hour, had realized my name was still the one line in a $52 million contract that nobody at Orion had ever gotten around to erasing. To understand why that phone call from the 12th floor mattered, you have to understand what it actually took to become the name written into a client's contract. For 19 years, I built and ran drone delivery rollouts for Orion Skyfreight, and for most of that time, I didn't need a status dashboard to tell me a build-out was drifting. I could hear it in the pitch of the loading dock conveyors before I ever pulled up a report. A half-second lag in the handoff cadence meant a routing table was mis-synced somewhere upstream, 3 sites out of 10, before anyone on the ground had filed a single ticket about it. 6 weeks before the removal, I flew down to the Memphis hub for Meridian's second site validation, a converted freight depot on the airport perimeter, diesel and ozone thick enough to taste walking the tarmac. I pulled the handoff logs at the loading dock, scanned 3 days of drone-to-truck transfer times in under 2 minutes, and caught a 4-second delay pattern nobody else had flagged. A firmware mismatch on 6 delivery units, quietly costing Meridian's trucks their tightest transfer windows. I filed the fix that afternoon and verified it before my flight home. Nobody at Meridian ever knew there'd been a problem, because problems I caught early never got the chance to become stories. Manav Malhotra, who'd run vendor relations with me since Orion's earliest contracts, found me in the break room afterward. "You're still the only one who walks a dock before reading a dashboard, Miles," he said, not looking up from his coffee. I didn't answer. I just touched the badge holder at my belt and went back out to finish the walkthrough. None of that mastery came free. I'd missed more of my daughter's soccer tournaments than I could count chasing site validations, and the marriage that ended 4 years ago had ended, in part, over how many Memphis flights I'd taken on short notice. I never explained that to anyone at Orion. A man who explains his sacrifices out loud usually stops being trusted to make them quietly. What I actually held wasn't glamorous. Contract terms. Site validation protocols. A relationship with Elena Castillo and her team built over 2 years of showing up exactly when I said I would. Executives only knew the Meridian account ran clean. They never asked who kept it that way. The same way people trust a runway without asking who inspected the surface underneath it. That was 19 years of the arrangement. I showed up, the client trusted the name on the contract, and nobody upstairs ever had to think about what happened if that name changed without anyone telling the client first. The key personnel clause itself was nothing exotic. Large clients write them into 8- and 9-figure engagements all the time. A short paragraph naming the individuals whose continued involvement was a condition of signing, with formal notice and consent required before any of them could be swapped out. Meridian's version named exactly one person on the delivery operations side. Mine. Elena's predecessor had insisted on it 3 contract cycles earlier, after a different vendor rotated out their entire program team mid-rollout and left Meridian holding a half-finished network. I'd simply been the name still standing when the ink dried. I'd read that clause exactly once, the way you read an insurance policy you assume you'll never need. It sat in a drawer of contract terms nobody at Orion thought about day to day, asking nothing of anyone, right up until someone decided the name in that paragraph was inconvenient. Mateo Figueroa had been Orion's SVP of Client Operations for 6 years when he first mentioned Adrian's MBA in a meeting that had nothing to do with Adrian. It was a Monday, 3 weeks before the removal, in Mateo's corner office. The framed photo of his son's graduation angled so every visitor saw it first. Adrian finished his program at the top of his class, he said, apropos of a budget review. Full-time offers from 3 firms. He turned them all down to come here. That's good news, I said, because it was. I want to talk succession readiness on the Meridian account, he said, sliding a folder toward me I hadn't asked for. Long term. You've carried that relationship a long time, Miles. Nobody's questioning that. But Meridian's about to triple in scope, and I want fresh energy on it going forward. Fresh energy meaning what, specifically? Meaning Adrian shadows you for a few weeks. Gets exposure. Standard succession planning. Shadowing is fine, I said. I've trained a dozen program leads over the years. What I want to understand is whether succession readiness means shadowing or means something with a timeline attached. Mateo smiled the particular smile of a man who'd already decided the answer and didn't want to say it out loud yet. Nothing's decided. I just think it's smart to build redundancy into an account this size. What happens if you get hit by a bus, Miles? Then whoever inherits it reads the contract first, I said. Meridian has a key personnel clause. Any change in who's leading delivery operations requires their formal sign-off before it happens, not after. I'm aware of the clause. Then you're aware it's not optional. It's a formality, he said, waving a hand. Elena likes you. She's not going to blow up a $52 million rollout over a staffing memo. I wouldn't test that. I'm not testing anything. I'm building bench strength. Does Adrian have logistics experience? Drone operations specifically? He has an MBA, and he's a fast learner. That's how careers start, Miles. Somebody gave you a first account once too. Somebody gave me a first account nobody depended on for $52 million, I said. This one has a contract clause with Meridian's signature on it. That's a different category of first account. You're overcomplicating a mentorship request. I'm not overcomplicating anything. I'm telling you what happens if the wrong name ends up in that seat without Meridian signing off on it first. He closed the folder, the conversation apparently over as far as he was concerned. Just have Adrian sit in on your next 2 site calls. That's all I'm asking right now. That part's fine, I said. Sitting in isn't running it. Understood, he said, in the tone of a man who had understood nothing at all. Walking back to my desk, I turned over a harder question than anything Mateo had actually asked me. At what point does protecting a client relationship for 19 years stop being loyalty and start being a debt the company never intended to repay? I didn't have a clean answer, and I'm not sure anyone in my position ever does. This is a new channel, and I don't take it for granted that anyone stays past the first few minutes of a story like mine. If you're still here, that's the only reason there's a new one of these waiting tomorrow. I didn't argue further. Arguing with a man who's already decided what, just for now, eventually becomes has never once changed what it becomes. I thanked him and left, thinking about a clause I hadn't reread in 3 years. The one document in that relationship Mateo, for all his bench strength talk, clearly hadn't read closely enough to understand what it would eventually cost him to ignore. 3 weeks later, on a Monday morning, Mateo called me into his office again, and this time Adrian was already sitting in the second chair. "Miles, thanks for coming in," Mateo said, the same easy tone from 3 weeks earlier, like nothing about the room had changed. "We've decided to move forward with the leadership transition on Meridian. Effective immediately, Adrian's taking over as program director. You'll be reassigned to the Charlotte account." "Has Meridian signed off on this?" "This is an internal staffing decision. It's an internal staffing decision that requires external sign-off. That's what the clause says." "I've read the clause," Mateo said, which I already knew wasn't true, because a man who'd read it wouldn't have called this a formality twice. "It requires notice for material changes. We'll notify Elena in due course. This is a smooth handoff, not a material change. Removing the named key personnel is the definition of a material change." "I appreciate you being thorough, Miles." "I do. But I've made the call, and I need you to support Adrian through the transition, not relitigate the org chart." Adrian, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. "I don't want this to be weird," he said. "I know you built this account." "It's not weird," I said. "It's just not done the way it's being done." "What would you have done differently?" Adrian asked, and I believe the question was genuine. "I'd have called Elena myself before this meeting happened, not after," I said. "Whatever you inherit it clean." "Adrian doesn't need a lecture on process," Mateo said. "He needs support." "I'm not lecturing him. I'm answering his question." Mateo's voice cooled by exactly 1 degree. "This account will save us roughly $6 million a year in what we'd otherwise pay to backfill your role externally at market rate. Adrian starts at a fraction of that. That's a business decision, and it's mine to make. $6 million for $160,000. That was the precise number, close enough to the one he'd actually cite later in a leadership meeting, dressed up as operational efficiency rather than what it actually was. The cost of installing his son without paying to recruit anyone external who might have asked harder questions about skipping the notice period. I'd built entire budget models on numbers like that one in 19 years of program reviews. It didn't take much to recognize when a saving was really just a shortcut wearing a spreadsheet. "I'll support the transition," I said. "I won't lie to Meridian if they ask me a direct question about it. I want that understood before I walk out of this room." "Nobody's asking you to lie." "Then we don't have a problem," I said, and meant it more literally than either of them understood. I hadn't threatened anything. I hadn't promised to make a call I had no intention of making. I'd simply told the truth about the one thing I was and wasn't willing to do, and let Mateo decide, on his own, whether that was a risk worth taking. I closed my notebook and left the folder of Charlotte account materials sitting on my new, smaller desk, untouched for the rest of the day. Whatever Mateo thought he'd just finished in that room, the clause he'd skipped over twice wasn't finished with him yet, and it was never, at any point, going to ask his permission before it stopped being a formality he could wave off in a meeting. Elena Castillo called my new desk on the Charlotte floor 3 days after the meeting, her voice as easy as it always was. "Miles, quick one. Are you still planning to run the site walkthrough next month? Or is that on Adrian's calendar now?" A normal question. The kind vendor contacts ask constantly about logistics, not politics. "I'm off the Meridian account as of Monday," I said. "Adrian Figueroa's running delivery operations going forward. He'd be your contact for the walkthrough." There was a pause on the line, brief enough that anyone not listening for it would have missed it entirely. "Since Monday." "Okay. Thanks for letting me know, Miles." That was the entire conversation. I didn't explain why. I didn't editorialize, didn't hint that I disagreed with the decision, didn't ask her to do anything with the information. I answered a scheduling question honestly, the way I'd answered 100 scheduling questions from Elena over 2 years, and hung up the phone to go back to a Charlotte account file I still hadn't opened. That evening, at my kitchen table, I pulled up my own copy of the Meridian Master Services Agreement, a document I was entitled to as the contract's named point of accountability, nothing confidential about it. nothing I hadn't read a dozen times over the years it governed. I found the page, folded soft at the corner from age, and read it slowly, the way I read a run book before signing off on a build-out. Not to confirm what I already believed, but to make sure I wasn't remembering it more favorably than it actually said. Section 14.3, the Key Personnel Clause. Any change in the delivery operations lead required written notice to Meridian's vendor management office and formal consent, executed before the change took effect, not after. No exceptions for internal reorganizations. No grace period. I read the paragraph twice more, tracing the actual sentence with one finger the way I used to check load calculations on a printed manifest, out of a habit older than the contract itself. It said exactly what I remembered it saying. I hadn't inflated it in my head to make a point. If anything, I'd underestimated how specific it was. I touched the badge holder at my belt, out of habit more than need, and kept reading. Meridian ran a standing quarterly vendor relationship and compliance review. I knew the cadence from having sat through 4 of them myself over the years, active personnel rosters cross-checked against named contract terms, line by people whose entire job was noticing exactly this kind of discrepancy. The next one was already on Meridian's calendar, independent of anything at Orion. 19 days out from tonight, 22 from the meeting that had started all of this. I hadn't scheduled that review. I hadn't reminded anyone it existed. I hadn't done a single thing to point Meridian's compliance team towards Section 14.3. I'd simply told a colleague, honestly, which account I was and wasn't running anymore, and let a process that had existed for 3 contract cycles do what it had always been built to do, on its own calendar, whether Mateo had bothered to read it or not. I closed the laptop and set the badge holder on the table beside it, the scuffed leather catching the kitchen light for a second before I looked away. Whatever happened in 19 days wasn't going to be my doing. It was just going to be true, in exactly the way true things eventually are, whether or not anyone had the courtesy to prepare for it first. Mateo told leadership, the following Monday, that the Meridian transition had gone seamlessly, according to Manav, 2 seats down the table. Seamlessly, Manav told me over coffee. Twice. Was it seamless? Adrian missed the Tuesday handoff call, rescheduled the Thursday one. When he finally ran the Friday site sync, he read off slides I'm fairly sure I wrote 2 years ago, verbatim, with my name still in the footer. Did anyone say anything? I said something. To Mateo, in the hallway. He told me Adrian was still finding his rhythm, and that I should focus on my own accounts. Manav took a slow sip of his coffee. For what it's worth, an analyst asked me yesterday whether Adrian actually knew what a handoff cadence was, or just knew the phrase. I didn't laugh, not exactly, but something close to it crossed my face before I caught it. Manav didn't comment. He just kept drinking his coffee. Adrian, to be fair to him, wasn't malicious about any of it. He called me twice that week, on his own. Can I ask you something technical? He said the first time. The transfer window calculations. I don't fully follow how they're derived. They're based on drone battery cycle time plus truck dock availability, weighted by site. I said, I can walk you through the formula if you want it. I'd appreciate that. I walked him through it, fully, the way I'd have walked through it with any new hire. He called again 2 days later, about a firmware update schedule that ran differently at one site than the others. Is that a bug? He asked. No, that site's on an older hardware revision. It needs a longer buffer. It's in the site notes. I didn't see site notes. They're in the shared drive, under the original build-out folder. I can send you the link. I'd appreciate that too. A pause. Miles, I know this is weird for you. For what it's worth, I didn't ask for the account to be handed to me this way. I believe you, I said, and I did. Nothing required me to make things harder for someone who hadn't asked to be dropped into an impossible seat 3 weeks into a rollout he didn't understand yet. I just answered what he asked and didn't offer anything he didn't. What Adrian didn't do, in either call, was ask about Section 14.3 or whether Meridian had formally signed off on his taking over the account. I didn't bring it up. It wasn't my job to keep the paperwork honest on an account I no longer ran, and volunteering it would have looked like exactly the interference I'd spent 19 years avoiding. Mateo, meanwhile, stood up at a leadership all-hands and said the Meridian relationship had never been stronger, that Adrian's fresh perspective was already showing in client satisfaction. The entire claim rested on one warm email Elena had sent thanking Adrian for his enthusiasm. The kind of email any client sends a new contact in the first polite weeks, before anything has actually gone wrong yet. He read the email out loud. Manav told me afterward. The whole room clapped. Did he mention the walkthrough gap? Or the missed handoff call? Would you clap for that? 22 days sounds abstract until you're the one watching it burn down in silence. By the time Mateo stood up at that all hands and called the relationship stronger than ever, the review that would prove him wrong was already on somebody's calendar in Meridian's compliance office, printed, dated, and completely indifferent to how the applause in that room sounded. Meridian's vendor relationship and compliance review convened at 9 that Tuesday morning, 22 days after the removal, exactly on the calendar it had followed for 3 straight contract cycles, whether anyone at Orion remembered that calendar existed or not. I wasn't in the room. I was at my desk on the Charlotte floor, reconciling a routing table that had nothing to do with drones or Memphis, when Manav texted me at 9:40. Heard Adrian got pulled into an emergency call with Meridian Legal. Nobody knows why yet. Do you know something I don't? He called and asked outright, 20 minutes later. I know a review was scheduled, I said. I don't know what they found in it. Come on, Miles. I'm serious. I answered one honest question from Elena 19 days ago. Whatever's happening in that room isn't coming from me. By 10:15, Manav called again. It's section 14.3. Their contracts team flagged an unauthorized personnel change. Legal's asking whether the $52 million engagement is even validly staffed right now. That's not unusual for a clause like that, I said. It's designed to ask exactly that question. Do you understand what this costs them per day if Meridian actually walks? $52 million spread over the 12 months left on the contract works out to something like $142,000 a day in recognized revenue. A week of this dragging on is close to $1 million gone, before anyone even gets to the penalty clauses. I didn't write the clause, Manav. I just finally watched someone else's decision run into it. By 11, the floor had the particular hum of a building pretending to work while doing nothing but refreshing the same internal thread. My phone buzzed twice, numbers I didn't recognize. I let both go to voicemail and finished the routing table first. Manav called a third time. Legal's asking whether you were ever formally consulted about the transition before it happened. I raised the clause with Mateo directly, 3 weeks before it happened. In front of Adrian, the second time. Did you put any of that in writing? No. I said it out loud, in his office, twice. That's going to matter in about an hour, Manav said. I'd get ready to say it again. At 11:20, Mateo called Adrian into his office. According to Manav, who heard it secondhand from someone standing near the door, Adrian said one sentence that made the whole floor go quiet. Elena's asking why nobody at Orion ever sent the sign-off request. She says her contracts team pulled the file and there isn't one. What did Mateo say back? I asked. Nothing, according to whoever was listening. Just sat there. For how long? Long enough that somebody went and got him water. The rest of the afternoon passed in the slow motion of a building waiting to find out how bad something already is. At 4:11, the CEO's assistant finally called down to my desk directly and asked me to come up to the 12th floor as soon as I could. No explanation given, no urgency in her voice that she was willing to name out loud. I touched the badge holder at my belt, straightened my jacket, and walked to the elevator, past a hallway of people speaking in the lowered voices of a building that already suspects the story it's telling itself isn't the real one. Nobody stopped me to ask what I thought was happening. Nobody needed to. Whatever Mateo had told himself 3 weeks ago about a formality, the clause he'd waved off twice, in front of witnesses, was no longer asking anyone's permission to matter. The CEO, Renata Voss, was still on the phone when I walked in. She held up one finger, then set it down. Miles, thank you for coming up. She gestured at the table, where Mateo sat, not meeting my eyes. Elena Castillo is joining by phone shortly. First, did you know, 3 weeks ago, that removing you from Meridian without sign-off would violate the contract? I told Mateo that in his office, I said. Twice. Once alone, once in front of Adrian. Mateo finally looked up. I never said it wasn't a risk. I said it was manageable. You said it was a formality, I said. Those aren't the same word. Renata's phone buzzed. She answered it on speaker. Elena, you're on with me, Mateo Figueroa. and Miles Rutherford. Miles, Elena said, her voice loosening slightly at my name. I'll be direct. Our contracts team flagged an unauthorized change in key personnel on the delivery operations lead. That's a material breach under Section 14.3. We're not required to continue funding a $52 million engagement under those terms. I understand, Renata said. What would Meridian need to see from us to continue? Reinstatement of the named individual, formally, in writing, or we begin transition planning to another vendor within 30 days. This was never about Adrian personally. It's about a signature that wasn't ours to remove. Mateo cleared his throat. This feels like an overcorrection for a staffing formality. Mr. Figueroa, Elena said, colder now. I've read the notes confirming Mr. Rutherford raised this exact concern with you twice before it happened. This isn't a technicality. It's the one thing we specifically asked to control, and it was taken without a conversation. Renata didn't look at Mateo again. Miles, would you be willing to resume the account? I'd want it in writing this doesn't happen again without Meridian's consent, I said. And I want the record to reflect I raised this before it became a problem. Done, Renata said. Anything else? I touched the badge holder at my belt, the same scuffed leather it had worn on every site walkthrough for 19 years. Give me a day to think about the rest. I'm not sure resuming is actually what I want anymore. Renata looked at me for a moment, then at Mateo, then back at me. Take the day, she said. Elena's voice came through the speaker again, softer now. Miles, whatever you decide, Meridian's position isn't really about the vendor. It's about you specifically. That's why the clause named you by name in the first place. I appreciate that. For what it's worth, if Orion isn't the right place for you to keep doing this work, that's a conversation Meridian would be open to having separately. I'm not authorized to say more on this call. Mateo's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Renata's expression didn't change either, though I suspected she understood exactly what Elena had just implied, and how little standing she had to object in front of a client whose $52 million was still, technically, on the table. Thank you, Elena, Renata said. We'll follow up within 24 hours. The line disconnected. For a moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. Miles, Mateo started. I never intended. You intended to give your son an account he wasn't ready for, and let the paperwork catch up quietly, after the fact. It didn't catch up quietly this time. That's not something I did to you. That's just what happens when a contract means what it says. Elena called my personal cell the next morning, not my Orion line, which told me most of what I needed to know before she said a word. I meant what I said yesterday, she told me. Meridian's been thinking about bringing delivery operations advisory in-house for a while. Not replacing a vendor, just having someone who answers to us directly on programs this size. The board's been asking for it since the last vendor transition went sideways. Would you consider it? I didn't answer right away. I thought about 19 years of flights to Memphis, about a marriage that hadn't survived them, about a folder of Charlotte account materials still sitting untouched on a desk that was never going to be mine in any way that mattered. I'd want to hear the terms, I said, but yes, I'd consider it. The offer, when it came in writing a week later, was a multi-year advisory contract, direct with Meridian, built around exactly the program oversight I'd spent 19 years learning to do without anyone watching me do it. Between the signing package and the first 2 years guaranteed, the total came to $6,890,000, a number that would have sounded absurd a month earlier, and now just felt like the overdue price of 19 years nobody had bothered pricing correctly before. I gave Orion my notice the same week. Renata accepted it without much surprise. Mateo didn't call. On my last morning, clearing out the Charlotte desk that had never quite felt like mine, I walked past his old corner office and found the door propped open, the wall behind his desk bare except for a rectangle of less faded paint where the graduation photo used to hang. A facilities cart sat outside with one box on it, his name taped to the side, addressed 3 floors down. Adrian stayed on, reassigned to a smaller account with an experienced co-lead, an arrangement I heard he'd asked for himself. Badge holder still clipped to my belt. I didn't feel triumphant about any of it. Mostly I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after holding still exactly as long as holding still was ever required. I never called Meridian first. I never asked Elena to intervene, never hinted I wanted the account back, never suggested the clause should be enforced against anyone. I answered one honest question about my calendar and let a paragraph Elena's predecessor had insisted on 3 contract cycles earlier do exactly what it had always been sitting there quietly to do. People ask sometimes whether I feel bad for Mateo. I don't particularly. What I feel is closer to familiar, the specific, unglamorous relief of watching a company finally notice the value of something it had spent years treating as replaceable, a beat too late to matter to the person who'd been carrying it the whole time. I think, more than anything, about what that graduation photo meant to Mateo, angled so every visitor saw it before they sat down. I don't doubt he loved his son. I doubt he ever considered that loving him and protecting him from consequence were 2 different things, and that the second, applied badly enough, tends to cost the person you're protecting more than it saves them. Adrian is better off on the smaller account, with a co-lead who'll actually teach him something. As for the badge holder, I still carry it. The leather's more worn now than it was the day of that phone call, and I've never bothered replacing it.